Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story you didn't know you were already part of. Imagine this. You're sitting in a classroom, handed a right-handed desk, expected to shake hands with your boss using your right hand, and gently mocked for holding your fork with your left. It seems like nothing, just quirks of modern life. But what if I told you this quiet bias was born from medieval fear, superstition, and centuries of social engineering? You won't believe this, but being left-handed in the Middle Ages wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Alright, before you get too cozy, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe, but only if your heart says yes. And hey, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing the map fill up. Dim the lights, get that fan going for some background vibes, and let's chill into tonight's little adventure. You walk through a bustling medieval town, narrow alleys, timber-framed homes, 1,000 smells you'd rather not name. And as you pass the marketplace, you notice something strange. People are exchanging goods, passing coins, slapping backs in greeting, but always with the right hand. No one touches anything with their left unless they're gutting fish or scraping muck from the stones. You, with your naturally left-handed ways, try to hand a coin to a merchant. He hesitates. His face hardens, and he jerks his head sideways in suspicion. "Left hand of the devil," he mutters. And just like that, your afternoon goes cold. In medieval Europe, being left-handed was more than just a quirk. It was a mark of danger, even evil. The Latin word for left, sinister, didn't help. People believed the left hand was tied to witchcraft, demonic possession, or deceit. Children caught writing with their left were beaten, forced to switch hands, or even shamed in public. You couldn't inherit titles or become a knight in some areas if you were known to favour the left. And that wasn't just symbolic. Shields were worn on the left arm so that the dominant right could wield a sword. If you used your left, people assumed you were tricking your opponent, dishonourable. Even tournaments had rules banning left-handed techniques. As you slip into a crowded tavern, the wooden mugs clunk together in cheers. You raise yours left-handed and notice a man across the room stiffen. He watches you with narrowed eyes. You're a stranger. You're different. That's enough to be dangerous here. Even cutlery was arranged to enforce right-hand dominance. The knife stayed on the right, the spoon or eating hand followed. Using your left, it meant your right might be unclean. And yes, the left hand was often reserved for toilet duties. You were expected to eat, shake hands, and even bless with your right, the left. That hand stayed discreet. But here's the strangest part. This bias never really left. It crawled forward, disguised as good manners. Most modern school desks are designed for right-handed writers. Scissors, kitchen tools, door handles, all optimized for the right. In job interviews, handshakes still come from the right, because offering the left can feel wrong even if no one knows why. And yet, tucked in corners of the village, there were always a few rebels. Left-handed stonemasons whose chisel marks slanted the opposite way. Knights who trained secretly with left-dominant strikes to confuse opponents. A few historical figures even celebrated their left-handedness in secret correspondence, knowing full well what it could cost them. You're not just left or right-handed here. You're obedient, or you're a threat. The tension follows you like a shadow as you make your way out of the tavern. Even the children in the alleyways glance sideways when you absent-mindedly wave with your left. You tuck that hand into your cloak, not out of fear, but out of weariness. You're starting to feel what generations felt before you, what it meant to be quietly wrong in a world that never explained why. As evening sets in, bells ring from the town's stone chapel. The sound is pure, echoing through the square, and for a moment you forget. But then you notice the priest preparing for Mass. Everything done with the right hand, crossing himself, swinging the incense, handing out blessings. The left, motionless, unused, symbolically silenced. This wasn't just cultural, it was baked into religious life. Monks wrote rules for conduct that strictly forbade left-handed blessings. In fact, using the left hand for holy acts could be seen as heresy. In baptismal rites, the right hand was used to touch the child, the left was considered impure. Even angels were said to sit at the right hand of God. The left? Well, that was the domain of darker things. And yet, the resistance persisted. In the margins of some medieval manuscripts beautifully illustrated by hand, you'll find sketches clearly drawn with a left-leaning slant. Quiet rebellions, the kind only scribes or illuminators might notice centuries later. There was even a secret code among some guilds. A left-handed craftsman marked his tools a different way, usually with a diagonal notch that faced the opposite direction, hidden but proud. You step into a candlemaker's shop, warm and wax-scented. The apprentice there, barely more than 16, melts down a slab of tallow and deftly pours with his left. You say nothing, he says nothing. But in his eyes there's a flicker of surprise. He saw you notice. A quiet recognition passes between you. Maybe he'll go on to be a respected tradesman. Maybe he'll be forced to retrain, like thousands before him. Or maybe he'll just keep pouring candles with the wrong hand and hope no one cares. Fast forward to today. You walk into a classroom and the only left-handed desks are few and shoved into corners. You go to buy a pair of scissors. Cheap ones only fit the right. Even handshakes still default to the right, because centuries ago it meant you weren't carrying a dagger in that hand. Your body is still performing silent gestures from a paranoid age. And you've never questioned them. Why should you? But now you know that single motion, passing a cup, opening a door, shaking a hand, is loaded with medieval muscle memory. It's not just politeness, it's history, alive in your bones. The old towns are gone, the priests quieter, the knights long buried. But in small everyday movements, those old suspicions and quiet punishments linger. You carry them in your muscle, your manners, your cutlery drawer. And tonight, maybe as you fall asleep and tuck your left hand under the pillow, you'll wonder what else you're doing just because someone centuries ago told you not to. You find yourself walking toward the square again, the morning mist curling around your boots, and you're struck by how stiff the air feels. Not from the cold, but from something else. A pair of men approach from the opposite end of the street. As they near, they both stop, nod, and reach out their right hands. You hesitate. Not out of rudeness, but because, well, how often do you think about why we shake hands? The answer, of course, is hiding in plain sight. In medieval towns, people didn't just say hello, they demonstrated trust. A handshake was never just a gesture of politeness. It was a proof of peace, a public display that you weren't carrying a weapon. Open hand, palm visible, no dagger tucked beneath the cloak. You weren't a threat, you were safe. In a world where backstabbing wasn't metaphorical and where alleyway disputes could end in blood, the handshake was life insurance. Refuse to shake? You might as well spit on someone's shield. And this extended far beyond knights and nobles. Even common folk, millers, blacksmiths, merchants, were bound to the same customs. In some towns, greeting without the expected gesture could be taken as a deliberate insult. In certain guilds, you weren't allowed to begin negotiations without first clasping hands. Contracts sealed with handshakes were considered stronger than those sealed with wax. But here's where it gets a little weirder. You duck into a cloth merchant shop. The woman behind the counter smiles and offers her hand, not extended forward, but upward, palm facing herself. You recognize it. An old Saxon-style oath gesture. This was how people once promised loyalty. Not just a handshake, but a half vow, a subtle message. I mean what I say. You mimic the motion. Her smile widens, a small nod. Transaction complete. That instinct to extend the right hand has followed us like a faithful hound across time. But not all greetings were equal. In medieval France, the handshake was often replaced with a double hand clasp, a political tool. In Italy, cheek kissing took hold, but only when both hands were visible, held open to the side. In the Holy Roman Empire, a particularly elaborate gesture, pressing the other's wrist, was designed to ensure no one was hiding a thin blade up their sleeve. And if you were a woman? Shaking a man's hand was often forbidden unless you were of noble rank or conducting official business. Even then, it had to be done delicately, sometimes through gloves to preserve modesty. Today, we shake hands before interviews, during meetings, even after job offers. But that gesture, so simple and swift, is older than the contracts we sign, and it was dead serious. Refusing a handshake in medieval times could end alliances or start wars. You stroll toward the town gate, and the guard stationed there glance your way. They don't reach for swords, they nod, and one casually extends a hand. It's instinct now. You respond with your own. You're not a stranger anymore. You're safe. The gate closes behind you with a creak of timber and iron, and the world beyond the walls opens into farmland and open sky. But the feeling lingers, the subtle ritual of that handshake, its unspoken meaning. You didn't just say hello, you declared yourself peaceful, harmless, a person of rules. Back in town, a different kind of handshake is taking place. In a stone hall filled with low-voiced men in woolen tunics, two parties sit across a worn wooden table. A land dispute is being settled. Nothing written yet. Just eyes, voices, and one moment of silence before both men rise, reach out, and grasp hands. Not a quick shake, a firm hold, a beat of stillness, a nod. Then they sit again. That's the contract. Only later will the scribe come and put it into ink. But everyone in the room knows the real deal was sealed when skin met skin. In some medieval regions, like Anglo-Saxon England, this was even codified into law. A handfast, literally a handheld binding, could signal everything from a land agreement to a betrothal. Couples joined hands before witnesses to declare intent to marry. The priest might arrive days later. Even now that word lingers in some Scottish wedding traditions. Hand fasting, where the couple's hands are tied together with ribbon or cloth. It wasn't invented by wedding planners, it was the law. But here's the strange part. People feared touch, not because of germs, but because of magic. Some believed a person's essence passed through the hand. Witches, it was said, could curse a man with a handshake. Others claimed a liar's hand would tremble when held. So the custom came with a risk and power. Touch was scrutiny, a test. As you pass a group of young apprentices in the square, you see one teaching the other how to greet a master. The right angle of the hand, the respectful grip, the eye contact held exactly 2 heartbeats. It's not just about manners, it's about survival. Showing submission, showing that you belong. Flash forward to a corporate boardroom. Suits replace tunics, fluorescent lights instead of candlelight, but the ritual remains. You stand, smile, and off your hand. They take it. Grip, pump, release. You sit. The deal proceeds. No one says why, but in some deep chamber of your mind, you know it matters. Weak grip raises suspicion. A hand left hanging stings, and in moments of crisis, say, an apology or a farewell, we still reach out palm first without knowing why. The medieval handshake wasn't about warmth. It was a weapon check, a trust test, a declaration of rules. And like so many other things from that world of stone and fire, It slipped into our bones and never left. As the bells toll again behind you, you wonder how many gestures you perform each day that aren't just habits, but relics, ghosts of necessity, dressed up now as etiquette. And next time someone reaches for your hand, maybe, just maybe, you'll feel the echo of chainmail in your wrist and see not a colleague across the table but a knight lowering his sword. You find yourself in the town scribe's chamber now, watching him dip a sharpened quill into ink. His fingers are stained black, his eyes strained from candlelight, and he pauses, frowning slightly before writing the first letter of the name you've just dictated. You notice it again. He shifts the quill from his left hand to his right. Even in private, alone with parchment, the rule holds. The left is for suspicion, the right is for truth. But as he begins, another rule sneaks into the ink. He underlines the name twice, then pauses to ask, "Do you spell it with the GH or without?" You blink. It's your name, isn't it obvious? And here you stumble into yet another strange medieval holdover, the rules of names, and how deeply they still control your life. Back in the Middle Ages, most people didn't need last names. You were Tom the Baker, or Elias John's son. But as towns grew and taxes multiplied, names had to do more than identify. You had to be tracked, fined, enlisted, punished. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to be Alice. You had to be Alice of Elm Street, or Alice Woolmaker, or Alice the Red. And so the surname was born out of necessity, not pride. It was your function, your location, or your relationship to someone else. That's why we still carry names like Taylor, Smith, or Brooks. You weren't special, you were sortable. But in some places that wasn't enough. You step into a nearby records office, stone walls lined with rolls of vellum, some rolled, some nailed flat. A clerk unrolls a massive scroll from the 13th century, revealing hundreds of names inked in cramped script. But next to them, a symbol, a mark, sometimes a drawing of a shoe or a sickle or a goat. Because literacy wasn't assumed, many people couldn't sign their names. Instead, they had to choose a visual identifier, what would now be considered a kind of emoji signature. A cobbler might mark a little boot, a brewer, a mug. You scan the list and find something even stranger. Some names are crossed out in red. You ask why. The clerk leans close and whispers, "Banned names." In certain regions, some first names were restricted, especially ones associated with rebels, heretics, or rival families. You couldn't name your son after a traitor or a former outlaw. The church, and sometimes even the crown, decided which names were safe. Sound familiar? Even today, some governments restrict baby names. In Germany, Iceland, and France, you can't name a child something deemed dishonourable, ridiculous, or impossible to gender. The rationale? Children are citizens, not private property. But the origin? You're staring at it. Medieval fears, immortalised in ink and law. As the clerk rolls up the scroll, you realise your own name, so ordinary now, might once have marked you for taxation, or protection, or punishment. And that surname you use every day? It began as an administrative shortcut. You were never meant to own it. You were meant to be catalogued. The records clerk eyes you curiously as you step back into the street, your name still echoing in your thoughts, not just as a word, but as a label, a legacy. It clings to you now, heavier than before. You look at people differently. That man sweeping the alley, probably descended from a Thatcher, the young woman selling herbs, likely a foster, once a child brought up by someone not her kin. Every name is a fossil, hardened by time. In the Middle Ages, your name wasn't chosen for beauty or meaning. It was assigned, shaped by law, trade, or tax. And once it stuck, it followed your descendants like a shadow. Some names weren't even descriptive. They were warnings. Crippen, for example, might derive from cripple or indicate some physical trait meant to distinguish you. Others were darker: slaughter, butcher, slinger. No romance, just profession or place. There was no vanity in naming, only utility. And if you wanted to change your name, good luck. In many towns, doing so without church approval was illegal. You could be fined, jailed, or even excommunicated. Identity was not a personal freedom. It was a bureaucratic anchor. Inside the guild hall, a merchant argues over a contract. You catch a glimpse of the parchment. Every person involved has signed, but next to one name is a wax seal with an image. Not a family crest, but a stylized pair of shears. It's not decorative. That was his housemark. Before widespread literacy, merchants used visual symbols for legal documents: a triangle for a stonemason, a wheel for a cartwright. These housemarks were registered, tracked, and in some cases passed down like property. Fast forward to now, you sign every document with your full name. Your legal ID contains a last name, first name, maybe a middle name, and in some countries you can't leave them blank. In hospitals, schools, banks and airports, names are sacred, but the system, it's ancient. Even modern databases, your social security number, your tax code, rely on medieval-style systems of sorting. Names became numbers, people became entries, and every time you spell yours out or tick a box next to surname, you're performing a ritual that began not with love or family or self-expression, but with control, and that control still shows up in surprising places. In some English parishes, even in the 19th century, children born out of wedlock were given surnames like Hobson, Truelove, or worse, nicknames designed to mark their status permanently. These weren't random. They were medieval leftovers, punishments disguised as paperwork. You think your name is yours. It feels personal, chosen. Maybe it sounds beautiful or strong or rare. But beneath the surface, it's a relic, assigned by clerks, shaped by kings, registered by monks, and passed down by people who never met you. And now, you carry that system in your wallet. You type it into online forms. You teach it to your children. You can change it, sure, but the moment you do, you're just entering another rule-bound tunnel, lined with forms and seals and approvals. You don't just have a name. You have a medieval operating system, humming beneath your life, whispering through every signature, every ID, every whispered roll call. And tonight, you'll fall asleep hearing it. Your name, softly spoken across time. The next morning you're standing outside the town dye house, a low smoky building thick with the scent of fermented roots and woolen steam. Bundles of cloth hang like ghostly skins from ceiling beams, deep crimson, muddy brown, faded blue. A merchant rushes past, clutching a roll of green velvet like it's gold. And in a way it is, because in medieval times colour wasn't a choice, it was a code. And wearing the wrong colour, that could cost you more than money. It could cost you your freedom, your job, even your head. You step inside. The dyer doesn't greet you. He's focused on the pot, swirling a paddle in thick purple dye. He glances up just long enough to take in your tunic. Brown, wool, safe, nothing too fancy. He nods. You're not trouble. But had you walked in wearing scarlet, oh, that would be different. In much of medieval Europe, sumptuary laws governed who could wear what. These weren't mere fashion guidelines. They were laws backed by fines, imprisonment, even corporal punishment. The purpose? To reinforce the social hierarchy. If you were a peasant, you wore undyed wool, maybe grey or brown. If you were a merchant, maybe dull blue or green. But purple? Gold thread? Scarlet silk? Those were reserved for nobles, or the church. One wrong outfit could be seen as pretending to be of a higher class, which was sometimes treated as fraud, and red was the trickiest of all. You walk past a woman selling ribbons. She quickly hides a bright crimson one beneath her stall. In certain towns, only prostitutes or courtesans could wear bright red in public. In others, it signalled wealth or court status. So how could anyone tell? They couldn't, and that's what made it dangerous. The wrong splash of colour could drag you into court. Even wedding dresses weren't white. In medieval Italy, brides wore red for fertility. In France, they wore blue to signal purity, but only if their family could afford the expensive dye. White? That came much later, after centuries of colour-coded meaning. And colours didn't just say who you were, they controlled how people treated you. In one infamous case in 14th century England, a merchant was accused of impersonating a noble simply because he wore sable-trimmed green robes. He had earned the money, but not the title. His punishment? All his clothing was confiscated and burned in the town square. But there were loopholes. You peek into a small tailor's shop behind the dye house. Inside, a clever young apprentice shows a customer 2 bolts of fabric, one a deep navy, the other a faint burgundy. "Not purple," he whispers, "but close enough to get respect." This was a common trick. Mixing plant-based dyes, tailors created almost forbidden colours that gave peasant status without breaking the law. You could look noble if you knew where to shop and how to explain yourself to a watchman, and even today, you might think your favourite hoodie is just comfy. But deep down, the fashion world is still built on these ancient rules. Luxury brands still guard certain colour rights, the infamous Louboutin red or Tiffany blue, dress codes at work, uniforms in schools, all modern reflections of the same logic. Colours control behaviour. You never meant to say anything with your clothes, but you always do, just like they always did. The tailor finishes wrapping the burgundy fabric, ties it with twine, and hands it off with a wink. The customer slips away, his step a little taller than before. You linger, curious now. How many people passed each other in the square, silently reading rank and class in the folds of cloth? How many lived their entire lives coded in colour? Because medieval people didn't just wear colours, they obeyed them. Even inside the church, colour was everything. Priests wore white for purity during Easter, black for mourning during Lent, and deep green during ordinary time. Every vestment had meaning, and those meanings shaped how entire communities thought about colours. Purple meant penance, red meant martyrdom, or scandal. The meaning bled into culture, into law, into you. You watch as a noble woman passes by outside, her dress shimmering with blue so deep it nearly looks black. That, you realise, is woad, a powerful blue dye that once fueled entire wars between regions in England and France. Growing and producing it was heavily taxed, heavily guarded. To wear blue was to display power, not gentleness. That came centuries later, with religious paintings turning the Virgin Mary's robes into soft sky blue. And green? Today it feels humble, natural. But in the medieval mind, green was chaotic, the colour of change, temptation, magic. Fairies wore green, so did outlaws. And guess what medieval doctors wore when performing surgery? Green robes. Not because it was sterile, it wasn't, but because it was thought to help balance the humours in the blood. Even now, some of those signals persist. Why do CEOs wear black suits instead of yellow ones? Why are judges and professors still draped in robes? Why do we see red and stop? See white and think, bride? Why do schools ban certain colours during graduation or formal events? Because deep down, the medieval coding system never really vanished. It just updated its palette. In some ways, it became more extreme. You pull out your phone and scroll through images, job interview advice telling you which colour ties project confidence, dating blogs claiming that red dresses increase attraction, fashion brands charging more for exclusive shades. You're back in the dye house, just digitised, glossy, and a little more subtle. One of the tailors leans over and shows you a secret sample book. Inside are fabric swatches, each labelled not with colour names, but with titles. Night's Dusk, Abbott's Ash, Peasant Bone. It's not for sale, it's a study guide, a memory of how things used to be, when colour alone could command respect or betrayal or death. You close the book slowly. Tomorrow, when you choose what to wear, you won't be thinking of Wood or cochineal beetles or who was allowed to wear gold in 1432. But your body will remember. Your instincts will pause at a certain shade of red. Your hand might reach for navy instead of green, and without knowing it, you'll obey. Not a trend, not a brand. A rule older than your country, older than your name. You've wandered through the market, dodged wagons and laundry lines, and now you're standing outside the town's public bathhouse, or what's left of it. The stone walls are crumbling. The old soot-stained chimney leans slightly to one side, and ivy has begun to reclaim the doorway. A wooden sign still hangs crooked above it, worn with time but unmistakable. A bucket, a basin, and a small cloth. 3 symbols that once meant privacy, hygiene, and social law. You duck inside, not for a soak, but for a glimpse into one of the most misunderstood and strangest sets of medieval rules still shaping your daily life: bathroom behaviour. The room inside is cool, echoey, and dim. A few empty tubs remain, now homes for dust and mice. But you can still picture it bustling, steam rising, attendants scrubbing, barbers shouting over splashes, a line of customers waiting in varying states of undress, and between them all, rules. So many rules. When to bathe, with whom, in what water, which hand? Because the medieval world wasn't as filthy as the myths suggest. People bathed, often communally and with surprising regularity. But how they bathed, and what came before and after, was tightly controlled. Start with the hands. From the time you could hold a spoon, you were taught right hand for eating, left hand for other things. And that wasn't a suggestion, it was enforced. Public punishments existed for people caught using the wrong hand at dinner. In some monasteries, monks had their hands inspected before meals. In certain households, servants were required to wash the Lord's right hand separately, and only with linen cloths. Why? Because the left was reserved for wiping, rinsing, or cleaning after defecation. In an age without toilet paper, cleaning rituals were sacred. Water basins, rags, even sand or moss were used, but always with the same etiquette: never mix the hands. You wander further in, passing a stack of half-rotted wooden buckets. Some still hold grey mineral crusts at the bottom, remnants of ash soap or vinegar mixtures once used to refresh the body. Men and women often bathed separately, but not always. In towns like Nuremberg or Paris, public bathhouses had coded times for mixed bathing, usually reserved for wealthier patrons. But in every case, one thing remained constant. Bathroom behaviour was a performance of social class. If you were wealthy, you had perfumed soaps, warmed towels, and even personal attendants to dry your limbs in order. If you were poor, you bathed at home or waited your turn at public tubs, often in reused water. Some towns allowed only a few buckets per person. Others imposed taxes on bathwater, claiming it wasted city resources. But what does this have to do with you now? You step into a modern bathroom. The design is sleek, sterile. Yet still, right hand opens the door, turns on the tap, dabs the towel. Left hand, you know what it's for, you don't think about it. But that instinct lives in you, it's built in. Even modern sanitation rules echo the same logic. We divide functions. We wash hands in a specific sequence. We even design sinks and toilet controls to be operated with different hands, most often right dominant layouts. And when we deviate from the clean side and dirty side of the body, it feels wrong, even if we don't know why. You didn't choose that. You inherited it. The bathhouse door creaks as you nudge it open and step back into the light. The morning fog has lifted, and the cobbled street feels brighter now, almost clean. But what clings to you isn't the steam or soap. It's the understanding that even privacy had regulations. And nowhere was that more strange, or more enduring, than in the medieval rules of where, when, and how you did your business. You stroll past a row of timber houses with small overhangs jutting out into the street. Above you, a shutter swings open and a warning bell clangs once, just once, before a bucket of dirty water sloshes down. You sidestep instinctively. Everyone does. That single chime is an ancient warning. One clang, wastewater. Two clangs, worse. Three clangs, pray it's not coming from above. Because before indoor plumbing, waste disposal was a carefully timed, publicly announced event. You had to follow the rules. In London, for instance, emptying your chamber pot into the street without shouting the required warning was punishable by fine, or stocks. And in some towns, you could only empty pots during specific hours. The phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," it came from the same era. Families reused water for multiple tasks. Last in the tub was the baby, and in dim light, you might not notice until too late. But medieval sanitation wasn't just chaotic, it was organised chaos. In some places, public jakes or latrines were built over rivers, with water wheels to carry waste away. In monasteries, toilets were arranged in a row along stone trenches that flushed with diverted rainwater. Even the word loo might trace its origin to the French l'eau, a shout meaning water, before someone dumped their pot from above. Still, these rituals weren't only about filth, they were about shame and control. Using the wrong place, or being seen doing so, was deeply humiliating. Medieval people prized modesty in this domain more than we often assume. They built privacy screens, separated men and women by time of day, and even passed laws against public urination, especially near churches or marketplaces. Some towns used public fines paid in soap or cloth, not coin, punishments meant to clean or cover. You step into a narrow alleyway and find something surprising. A flat stone built into the wall at waist height. It's not a shelf, it's a leaning slab, angled slightly for convenience. This was a piss stone, used mainly by men, shaped and placed for discretion. Many survive in old towns, today, unnoticed by tourists. But if you knew where to look, you'd realise every old wall has a memory. Fast forward to now, you wouldn't dream of using the street, but in public restrooms there are still rules. No eye contact, don't talk, skip every other stall. These unwritten codes are as ritualised as anything in the Middle Ages. And have you ever noticed? Bathroom signs often show men and women in stiff medieval postures, skirts, hats, neutral arms. Not too revealing, not too casual, still images of control. Even hand washing is a ritual. You do it without thinking. Turn the tap, squirt the soap, rub for 20 seconds. But this too has roots in monastic routines, where cleanliness was next to godliness, and where washing hands marked the boundary between sacred and profane. You never chose these movements. You inherited them. You perform them daily, not for comfort, but because somewhere deep inside your body still believes it must. Tonight, when you head to the sink and reach with your right hand, don't wonder why. You already know. The marketplace is unusually quiet when you pass through again. Stalls are shuttered, bread ovens cold, and the town crier, usually bellowing news of grain prices or new laws, is nowhere to be seen. But there's a reason for the stillness. It's the 6th day after the harvest moon, a day no one works unless they're desperate. Why? Because in this town, as in hundreds across medieval Europe, rest days weren't just suggested, they were commanded, and they weren't always Sunday. You follow a narrow path toward the bell tower, where a faded parchment is nailed to the door. The ink is cracked, but the message is clear. By order of guild and priest, no labour shall be done on this feast day. Penalties apply. This wasn't a rare event. In the Middle Ages, there were more than 50 religious feast days every year, not including Sundays. In England alone, some labourers had nearly 1/3 of the calendar off. But don't be fooled. These weren't modern holidays filled with naps and Netflix. These were controlled pauses, heavily structured by rules. If you were caught working, baking, weaving, even sweeping, on a prohibited day, your tools could be confiscated. In some towns, a blacksmith could be fined for hammering metal on a saint's day. In others, even preparing food beyond what was strictly necessary could be judged as sacrilegious labour. But what about Sunday? That was the big one. In most Christian regions, Sunday became the official day of rest under strict enforcement. Church bells didn't just call you to Mass, they signalled a hard stop to all labour. In some places, shopkeepers were locked out of their own stalls by city guards if they attempted to open them on the Sabbath. And here's where it gets strange. This idea of mandated communal rest didn't fade with the medieval world. It just changed form. You continue down the road and pass a quiet carpentry shop. A small hand-painted sign hangs on the door. Closed Sundays, Family Day. Seems sweet, modern. But it's the same medieval rule, just softened by time. In many countries today, Sunday trade restrictions are still on the books. In Germany, for example, most stores must legally close on Sundays. And in parts of Canada and the US, blue laws still limit alcohol sales and business hours on that sacred day. But the most surprising echo of this rule, the one you feel every Monday. In the medieval mind, Sunday was holy, and Monday was the recovery. That dreadful, dragging, sluggish Monday feeling. It's not just the start of the work week. It's the weight of centuries reminding your body it once had a longer rest. Monks and craftsmen in the 13th century often worked on a 6-day cycle. Yes, but Monday was slow. Some even used it for quiet tasks only, sharpening tools, cleaning shops, or reorganizing storage. Heavy work resumed on Tuesday. You think your Monday blues are about caffeine or traffic? Try 800 years of behavioural residue. The carpenter's shop remains closed as you pass, but you can hear quiet movement inside. Someone sweeping, perhaps. Something light. Something that won't draw attention, because even now some habits die hard. Just like centuries ago, there's always someone testing the limits of a rest day. You step into a side lane where the baker's apprentices are lounging on overturned crates, chewing dried figs and trading stories. One of them mentions how his grandfather used to get up early on Sundays just to pretend to work in the dark before bells rang, get the dough prepped before the Sabbath officially began. He never got caught, the boy brags. That trick, it's old. In medieval towns, early risers could skirt Sabbath laws by starting labour before sunrise, so long as they rested when the bells rang. In some towns, the enforcement was so detailed that timekeepers patrolled neighbourhoods, ringing small handbells to mark when tools had to be downed. Even stranger, the punishments varied by class. If a noble broke the Sunday rule, he might be fined a few coins or required to make a donation to the church. But if a cobbler dared to work, his tools might be nailed to his shop door in shame. And in one recorded case from Florence, a young tailor caught working on the Sabbath was forced to stand outside his stall wearing the unfinished garment, stitched halfway and inside out. Humiliation was the point, but rest wasn't just about obedience. It was about rhythm. The body, they believed, needed weekly rebalancing, not just from toil, but from spiritual corrosion. Even monks, the most regulated workers in Christendom, observed a day of silence in some orders. No labour, no speaking, just stillness. You didn't just rest your limbs, you rested your soul. Sound familiar? Today, productivity culture tells you to hustle 7 days a week, but your instincts rebel. You crave that one still day, that slow breakfast, that long afternoon with no screen. You feel guilty about it, and you shouldn't. You're not lazy, you're medieval. Even our modern calendars are shaped by this rhythm. The 7-day week has ancient roots, but it was in the Middle Ages that it became sacred, unchangeable. French revolutionaries tried to introduce a 10-day week in 1793. It failed. Too exhausting. Too strange. People missed the rest day. That deep, internal clock refused to adjust, and today we still judge time as they did. We don't ask, "How was your week?" We ask, "How was your weekend?" Because that's the anchor. That's the place where time bends, slows, softens, and in that softness we still follow the rules. No loud chores, no heavy work, something nice for dinner, maybe a walk, and always, always, that creeping melancholy when Monday appears again. The bells ring again from the church tower as they have for centuries, a soft, slow peal, not urgent, not commanding, just enough to remind you, this day is not like the others. It is protected. It is different. And whether you rest out of habit or rebellion or fatigue, know this: you are not the first. You're part of an ancient pact, inked not in law books, but in bread, bells, and silence. So tomorrow, when the Monday weight presses down, you'll know why it's there. And maybe, just maybe, you'll forgive yourself for feeling it. The afternoon sun is sinking as you stroll into the southern quarter of town, a place where roads narrow, houses crowd in, and the scent of hot bread mingles with horse sweat and coal smoke. But the real draw isn't the food stalls or the fading light. It's the slow line stretching around the corner of the apothecary shop. 20, maybe 30 people, all standing patiently, quiet, orderly. Not one of them speaks, and not one dares cut. Because in this part of town, there are rules about lines, ancient ones, and even though they aren't posted anywhere, everyone knows them. You take your place at the end of the line, curious now. The woman ahead of you nods slightly, acknowledging your position. The man behind you does the same. It's peaceful, civilized, almost natural, but it's not natural, not at all. The idea of standing in line, waiting your turn, is a deeply unnatural human behavior. In small tribal societies, people didn't queue. They competed, traded, or pushed forward. In ancient Rome or even early medieval courts, a crowd simply surged toward whoever had power. Those at the front got attention. Those at the back got nothing. But something changed. He glanced toward the apothecary's door. It creaks open every 2 minutes. One person goes in, one comes out. The rhythm is steady, controlled. And that control? It began in places like this. As towns grew in the later Middle Ages, crowd management became a problem. Market stalls were mobbed. Churches were overwhelmed during feast days. So guilds, parishes, and city councils began to enforce queuing rules. In some towns, merchants were fined if customers couldn't be served in visible order. In others, guards were stationed at public wells to ensure women collecting water didn't fight or jostle. But perhaps the most interesting push came from a surprising source: the church. During confession, people were asked to wait in line, not just for access, but to prove humility. Queuing became a spiritual test. Could you wait your turn? Could you resist the urge to shove or cheat? By the 14th century, towns like Bruges and Lübeck had begun marking queue lanes with painted lines or carved stones, especially near bakeries or moneylenders. And those who broke the line, they were shamed, not punished violently, just publicly corrected. People might call them greedy pig, or worse, lordling, mocking them for acting above the rules. You glance down. The cobblestones beneath your feet are uneven, but spaced in a way that subtly guides the line's shape. You wonder how many feet have stood here, how many generations have waited in exactly this spot, governed by the same silent agreement. Fast forward to today, you queue at banks, at bus stops, at theme parks. You tap your card and wait for a beep. You watch numbers on a screen listening for your name, and when someone cuts the line, your blood rises. Not because you lost time, but because they broke the pact. The unspoken, medieval pact. Even digital spaces follow it. Think about support tickets, online checkouts, turn-based games. Queuing isn't just physical. It's now coded into everything. And you follow it because it feels right. But the truth is, it was taught. And the lesson began in cobbled streets like this, long before modern life. The apothecary's door swings open again with its familiar creak. Another person exits clutching a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, and the next in line steps forward without hesitation. No one urges them. No one announces whose turn it is. The entire queue breathes as one, shift forward, pause, wait. And isn't that strange? Because you didn't sign up for this. No official taught you how to stand in line. You didn't take a class. But still, like everyone around you, you inherited a deeply medieval instinct, the belief that order is fairness and that waiting your turn is moral. It's easy to forget how radical that once was. In the early medieval period, power didn't wait. Nobles skipped to the front, priests were served first, and the sick, even those dying, could be pushed aside in a crowd if they lacked the right name or coin. But as towns grew more crowded and professions specialised, chaos could no longer be tolerated. The very idea of a civil society hinged on people agreeing to stand still and wait. But there was one place that turned queuing into ritual, the baker's door. You round a corner now and see one still open at dusk. The smell of rye and ash fills the air, and there it is again, a line. Not long, but rigid. In medieval France and England, bread distribution laws required bakers to serve customers in the exact order they arrived. Guards enforced it. If you skipped ahead, the baker could be punished. Not you, the baker. Why? Because in the church's eyes, it was the merchant's job to maintain fairness. He was held morally accountable for honest sequencing. You lean closer to the wooden doorframe and notice a few faint carvings. Not graffiti, queue marks. In some towns, regular customers would scratch a small symbol next to the door to indicate their place in line when the shop opened. A fish, a star, a crooked line. These were early tokens of fairness, used before paper tickets or digital screens. But the idea spread. Waiting one's turn became a mark of civility, a way to prove you were a good townsman, a respectable guild member, a trustworthy servant. The unruly, they were described as ungodly. The impatient, rude. Those who pushed ahead in crowds were sometimes barred from markets altogether. Fast forward again. Think of Black Friday. Think of vaccine rollouts. Think of government offices and airport gates. Still, the line holds, and when it breaks, the chaos feels personal, not just inefficient. Because this isn't just about time, it's about trust. In your quiet place in line, you're agreeing to an invisible contract first signed centuries ago. One that says, I won't cheat, and neither will you. And even when you're alone, number 107, waiting for your turn at the clinic, you believe that. You trust it. Because the alternative is returning to the crush of bodies, the shouted demands, the unfiltered scramble of pre-modern life. And somewhere, deep in your brain, carved like those old cue marks, the lesson stays: wait your turn, or be judged by history. As the sun dips low behind the crooked rooftops, you wander toward the edge of town, where a weather-beaten inn flickers with lantern light. A wooden sign swings above the door. Faded lettering, chipped corners, but unmistakable. The Boar and Crown. And just beneath it, carved in much older script, a strange phrase: "No man eats what he will not pay." Inside, the air is thick with the smell of smoke and spilled ale. Laughter rolls from a corner table, where a group of travellers, mud-caked boots and all, are clinking mugs and reaching for the bread basket. At the bar, a server clears plates and waits, and just before she leaves, one man leans forward, pulls a coin from his pouch, and drops it gently on the table. It's not the total, it's not the tip, it's a ritual. Because centuries ago, hospitality didn't just come with a cost, it came with an entire rule book. And tonight, you're going to learn why you still tip, why you still say thank you to a stranger serving you, and why the medieval tavern was one of the most dangerous places to break the rules. You take a seat in the corner, watching as the innkeeper moves behind the bar. He gives a nod to each patron, assessing who's drunk, who's new, who might skip out on the bill. This isn't just small talk, it's self-preservation. In medieval times, innkeepers were legally responsible for their guests. If someone died under their roof, or if a traveller vanished, they could be fined or even jailed. And the guests? They had rules too. You couldn't just eat and leave. In many towns, local ordinances required travellers to pay before the meal arrived, especially if they were not known to the house. Trust no stranger was more than a proverb. It was legal precedent. In London, a 14th century regulation even required innkeepers to post visible rate sheets, an early menu to prevent price disputes and bar fights. But tipping, that's the part that gets weird. In wealthier inns or in noble homes, it was customary to slip a coin to the servant before the meal, not after. This wasn't gratitude, it was insurance. The coin wasn't for good service, it was to ensure your food wasn't spat in. This custom was known by various names: Vales in England, Trinkgeld in Germany, but the purpose was always the same: grease the hands of those who handled your drink, your bed, and your privacy. And if you skipped it, you might find your wine unusually salty, or your pillow infested with lice. You glance toward the kitchen. A server emerges holding a tray stacked with bowls. One is passed to the loudest man at the corner table. He laughs, slips a coin across before touching the bread, and only then begins eating. The others follow. No one questions it. Because they know. Fast forward to today. You sit at a restaurant, the waiter brings the food, you nod politely. At the end you leave a tip, perhaps 15%, maybe 20%. It feels right. It feels fair. But the math? It's arbitrary. And the reason it feels right? That's centuries of social pressure whispering to you from long tables and wooden mugs. And in some ways, nothing has changed. You're not rewarding kindness. You're buying peace, an ancient silent transaction that says, I respect you. Please don't poison me. The inn hums with quiet order. Plates are cleared, ale refilled, coins slide across wood with practiced ease. You lean back in your chair and watch it all. The rhythm of payment, the subtle nods of thanks, the careful distance kept between server and guest. It's almost theatrical. But what you're witnessing isn't just good manners, it's survival. In medieval Europe, travelling was dangerous. Roads were riddled with thieves, towns suspicious of strangers, and inns, though warm and welcoming in appearance, were often sites of tension. That's why the rules of hospitality became so strict, so codified, so strangely familiar today. If everyone followed the dance, there'd be fewer chances for violence. And yes, violence was common. In one recorded incident from 1358 in northern France, a nobleman refused to pay the customary token to an inn-servant. That night his horse was found dead, his boots missing, and his chamber pot overturned inside his room. The innkeeper claimed ignorance, but townsfolk knew better. The nobleman had broken the pact, and in the tavern world no tip was a kind of insult. Even beyond food and lodging, hospitality extended to rules about touching things. If you borrowed a goblet, used someone's linen, even sat in the wrong seat, you were expected to leave a token in return. A coin, a carved bead, a lock of hair. In this way, tipping became a kind of offering to the space itself, not just the people in it. You notice now that even in this small inn, there are invisible lines drawn. Locals gather near the fire. Travellers sit along the edges. The server speaks to both, but differently. The innkeeper makes eye contact only with those who've paid. A man who lingers too long over an empty mug receives a glance. Not angry, but firm. It's a system, and it survives. Think of modern hotels. You tip housekeeping. Why? Because deep down, you know they see everything. You're vulnerable in that room. Your clothing, your toothbrush, your secrets. The tip isn't charity. It's a form of respect, an acknowledgement of invisible power. At restaurants, servers often make less than minimum wage, relying on tips to survive. This wasn't always a given. In fact, it was imported from feudal practices. In 17th century England, lords and merchants would encourage good service by giving coins to their staff's children, small rewards that were expected to be remembered and returned in loyalty. By the time tipping reached America, it had merged with class anxiety. The rich tipped to appear noble, the poor tipped to avoid seeming rude. And you? You keep the custom alive, even if you don't know why. You reach into your pocket, pull out a small coin and leave it on the table. The server returns. She says nothing but gives a tiny nod, as though something silent and ancient has just been confirmed. Because the tip isn't about numbers, it's about permission, passage, peace. And when you stand to go, no one stops you. You've paid the toll. You leave the inn behind, the warm chatter fading as you walk through the cool stone corridors of town, following the sloping road down to a quieter corner, the kind of place most people avoid after dark. The smell hits first. Not foul exactly, but earthy, damp and sharp. You round a bend and find yourself standing before a narrow stone structure built over a stream. Low arches, wooden slats, a carved symbol above the entrance, 2 crossed spoons and a basin. Welcome to the Privy Tower, the medieval public toilet. But this isn't just about where people relieve themselves. It's about the strange, highly specific rules that governed bodily functions and how they still influence you today, whether you know it or not. You step inside. The air is stale, and there's nothing but shadow, worn stone, and a faint trickle of water below. But it's quiet, and it's private. Sort of. Because in medieval times, privacy was a privilege. Most people shared latrines, benches, or pits. A row of holes in a wooden plank was the norm. No dividers, no curtains, just social awkwardness and a lot of coughing. And yet, even in these communal spaces, there were strict codes of behaviour. In certain monasteries, monks were assigned specific toilet times to avoid conversation and temptation. In castles, the noble family had private garderobes, tiny stone closets built over the moat or outer wall. But even there, you were expected to follow rules. You couldn't use it during meals. You couldn't linger. You couldn't face the wrong direction. And always, there was the matter of hands. You settle onto a stone bench just outside the old tower, listening to the stream below. The left-right hand division we talked about earlier, it originated here, in places like this. not from table manners, but from hygiene laws. You wiped with the left, you ate with the right. To mix them was to invite suspicion, or worse, accusation of uncleanliness, which in some towns could affect your ability to handle food, goods, or even testify in court. In London's city ordinances of the 14th century, there were laws regulating latrine use near marketplaces. You couldn't build a private privy within 20 feet of a food stall. If yours overflowed into a neighbour's property, you could be taken to court for stenching the air. Yes, that was a real legal term. But it wasn't all shame and punishment. Some cities were surprisingly organised. In medieval Paris, you find references to municipal latrine keepers, tasked with maintaining public facilities and enforcing use schedules. They collected waste, oversaw rotations, and ensured that strangers didn't linger too long. Some even posted signs. One in Dijon famously read, "3 minutes and no more, mercy on those behind." And yet, for all the noise and smell and shame, there was one crucial feature in every lavatory space: the water. Whether a diverted stream, a stone trench, or a bucket, medieval. Toilets were almost always designed to carry waste away. It wasn't perfect, but the logic was there. Out of sight, out of smell, out of town. Fast forward to now, you flush, you wash, you use paper, sanitizer, privacy locks. It all feels modern, but you're still following ancient logic. The spatial layout of restrooms, with sinks separated from stalls, with stalls turned to face away from the entrance, with mirrors to check for cleanliness, all echoes the same concerns medieval engineers had centuries ago. And the signs: male, female, hands-washing illustrations, all descendants of a world that saw cleanliness not as comfort, but as moral order. So next time you glance at that restroom sign, or wash your hands for exactly 20 seconds, know this: you're still sitting on a stone bench above a stream. You've just given it nicer plumbing. You rise from the stone bench, brushing dust from your coat, and step back into the lamplit street. The stream beneath the privy tower continues its soft murmuring, carrying away what the town no longer wants to see. But you're thinking now, not just about waste, but about rituals, the hidden ones, the quiet little steps everyone follows every day without ever asking why. You cross through a small courtyard where a washerwoman scrubs linens in a basin beneath a dripping spout. She works silently, her motions precise. Soak, scrub, wring, rinse. She moves to the right, then back to the left, except never with the same hand. The soap is always handled in her right, the dirt always wrung from her left. It's choreography, and it's learned. Because in the medieval mind, bodily cleanliness wasn't simply about staying clean, it was about staying in your place. There were unwritten, but widely understood distinctions between acceptable filth and unacceptable dirt. If a blacksmith's apron was stained with soot, that was respectable. But if a merchant's hands smelled of waste, or if a noble's tunic showed a splash from the gutter, that was disgraceful. And where was the boundary drawn? The bathroom. You glance toward a wooden door slightly ajar behind a stable. A flickering candle reveals a single chamber pot resting beside a slanted stool. That was the reality for most homes. No pipes, no running water, just a bowl, a rag, and a long walk to empty it discreetly. And you didn't just throw it out the window. Not anymore. By the 15th century, many cities had banned the practice of voiding from above, the infamous dumping of waste-out windows into the street. You had to carry it to a designated pit or stream, or hire someone to do it. In London, these were gong farmers, men paid handsomely and infamously to scoop, shovel and cart away human waste in the dead of night. They had their own tools, their own rules, and even their own legal protections. If you attacked one, the fine was double. Why? Because without them your city drowned in its own filth. And still, the shame remained. Even today, we speak of bathrooms in euphemisms: restroom, washroom, powder room, anything to avoid saying what it's really for, that discomfort, straight from the Middle Ages. Just as people once called privies the house of ease, or the place of necessity, we still pretend that the most human of actions must be hidden behind polite language. Even the layout of modern bathrooms follows old patterns. Think of chambered separation. The toilet is kept apart from the sink, the bin is hidden, the sounds are muffled. Why? Because the medieval home followed a similar logic. You didn't eat where you relieved yourself. In castles, the garderobe was built in towers or wall recesses far from living quarters, and if it shared a wall, it was stuffed with herbs and dried moss to mask the smell. Your ancestors thought of these things constantly: where to go, when to go, who might see, and even when new inventions arrived, flushing toilets, paper rolls, marble tiles, we kept the rituals. You finish your walk, stop beside a lantern post and look up. A small sign reads, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." It isn't biblical, it's medieval. And somewhere, under every sanitized surface and automatic flush, there's still a little stone bench over a stream, whispering that how you go still defines who you are. Morning returns, and with it the clang of a bell. Not a church bell this time, but a sharp metallic ring from the town square. You're pulled toward it instinctively. Others are already walking. Bakers in aprons, boys with empty baskets, old women leaning on sticks. No one speaks. No one questions it. They just follow the sound. And you realize you do this too. Not with bells, perhaps, but with the blip of your alarm, the chime of your phone, the announcement that your train is boarding. Medieval timekeeping didn't die, it simply modernized. As you arrive, a large bronze bell swings in its iron frame. It's mounted above the Guildhall, and it tolls once every morning, not just to mark time, but to begin it. In medieval towns there were no wristwatches, no synced schedules, no private clocks. Time was communal, shared, enforced, and it all came from here. You slip into the square and watch as shopkeepers begin unlocking doors. A blacksmith rakes out his coals. 2 scribes open shutters above their doorway. The rhythm is perfect, not early, not late, exactly when the bell tells them. This wasn't just about routine. In many towns, bells were law. The bell signalled when you could begin baking, buying, praying, or resting. In some places, noon literally meant the 9th hour after sunrise, because the bell said so. And where did the system begin? Monasteries. You pass an old stone wall with creeping ivy and peek through a rusted gate into what used to be a priory courtyard. Monks lived here once, and their day was measured by prayer, not productivity. They divided the day into canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Every few hours a bell would ring, not to hurry, but to pause, to realign. That monastic schedule leaked into the town. As monasteries built schools, hospitals, and workshops, their bells began to shape civilian life. Shop hours, school hours, court sessions, even markets were governed by bell time. If a vendor began selling before the morning bell, they could be fined or banned for unlawful trade. And here's where it gets stranger. As towns expanded, each quarter often had its own bell tower, and not all of them agreed. So a city could have 5 competing versions of the same hour, depending on whose bell you heard. That's why certain guilds began carrying pocket sundials, and why city halls started posting official time near their doors, usually carved into stone. Sound familiar? Today, you sync your phone, your watch, your coffee machine. You trust satellites and signals to keep you in rhythm. But the structure, the idea that your day begins and ends at someone else's signal, that's medieval. You step into a side street now, and hear a different sound. The clatter of shutters closing. Another bell is ringing, this one lighter. It signals the end of the working day. And just like that, the baker locks his stall, the blacksmith pulls down his grate, and a hush spreads across the quarter. Work is done. Not because people are tired, but because the bell has spoken. The final toll echoes off the stone walls like a soft command, and the town shifts. Boots slow, voices quiet. A few candles flicker in windows, but shutters close over them one by one. You pause at a crossroads, watching this orchestration of rest unfold, not as suggestion, but as ritual. And this is what's easy to forget. In the medieval world, the end of the workday wasn't when you finished. It was when you were told to stop. Many towns had curfews, not for crime, but for rhythm. A bell, often called the cover-fire bell, or couvre-feu, would ring to signal that all cooking fires must be dampened, tools set aside and streets cleared. The logic was partly practical. Fewer open flames meant fewer fires, but partly moral. Idleness was feared. Wandering after dark was frowned upon. Sleep was seen not as luxury but duty. Even now you hear echoes of it. The word curfew lives on, but so does the expectation that nights are for stillness. Your neighbourhood has quiet hours, city parks close, stores dim lights in the evening. Not because you want them to, but because time still rules behaviour. You continue walking past the old priory wall, now half covered in moss. On the other side, once upon a time, monks would gather for Compline, the final prayer of the day. It wasn't optional. At the sound of the bell, you stopped what you were doing and reported to the chapel. Even visitors and lay workers had to respect the call. No excuses. That sense of shared silence shaped everything. It was believed that communities who slept together in rhythm would stay safer, healthier, more obedient. And for a society bound by crop cycles, moonlight and candle rations, keeping time together wasn't just custom, it was survival. You arrive at your lodging house, and before going in, you glance up at the town clock tower. A tiny figure, carved in stone, holds a bell rope in one hand and a book in the other. That's not decoration. That's a warning. Mark your time, or it will mark you. And it still does. You check your watch, your phone, your planner. You talk about clocking in and clocking out. You obey silent alarms. You feel late when you're not. You feel guilty resting at noon. Why? Because your body isn't just tired, it's trained. Trained by bells that rang centuries before you were born. Even weekends, holidays, daylight saving, they're all descendants of the old rhythm, the sacred calendar carved out by abbots and magistrates. The same rhythm that told you when to wake, when to break bread, when to put down your tools, and when to close your eyes. You didn't choose that. But tonight, as you crawl beneath woolen blankets in a room of quiet walls and flickering shadows, you feel it anyway. A pull, a stillness, an old bell, no longer heard, but somehow still ringing in your bones. The room grows darker, but you're not quite ready to sleep. Something draws you back out onto the narrow lane, your footsteps softened by the evening hush. The lanterns glow dimly, each one a faint halo in the mist, and just as you round the corner toward the old southern gate, you see it. A small metal cage hanging from a post, barely lit by a swaying lantern. Inside it, no person, no object, just a flickering coal brazier, faintly glowing. It gives off little heat, but it gives off something more important, permission to be outside. Because here, in the medieval world, you don't roam at night without reason, or without light. You're standing beneath one of the earlier systems of curfew enforcement, where the rules weren't just social, they were spatial. In towns from York to Ghent, anyone caught walking after curfew without a lantern could be questioned, fined, or jailed. The message was simple. The dark belonged to danger, and if you had to move through it, you brought your own light and your explanation. This wasn't superstition. It was policy. You walk farther down the lane past a house with wooden shutters drawn tight. No candlelight seeps through. The family is obeying the rule. But above the door hangs a faint marking, a night watch pass chalked in red. It means someone in the house is permitted to move after hours. Perhaps they're a baker, a midwife, or someone on town business. Because not everyone could afford privacy, or curfew violations. In medieval towns, the wealthy were often exempt. They could hire watchmen to escort them through the night, carrying branded lanterns marked with the city's symbol, a crescent moon, a crown, a stag. These marks told the guards, this one is allowed. Everyone else? If you were caught wandering in the dark without a lantern or escort, you risked more than a scolding. In Paris, it might mean confiscation of your goods. In parts of Italy, you'd be taken to the square and held until morning, a mild punishment with a sharp sting, public embarrassment. And then there were the street lamps. You stop beneath one now, iron, soot-stained, capped with a smoke-blackened glass hood. It's not beautiful, but it's monumental. In towns like London and Bruges, street lighting ordinances were passed as early as the 13th century. Each household fronting a public road had to hang out a lamp from dusk until curfew bell. Failure meant fines. You might think your modern city invented streetlights, but you're walking through their roots right now. Even the idea of nighttime surveillance began here. Watchmen patrolled on foot, armed with spears and lanterns, calling out the hour and warning against thieves. One of the oldest recorded cries, 1 o'clock and all's well. A chant not for telling time, but for reminding the town, we're watching. Sound familiar? Home security systems, motion sensors, street lamps that flick on when you pass. Police patrols with timed rounds. Modern. Cities still obey the ancient logic of medieval light. And you? When you turn on your porch light, when you glance outside at 11 p.m. and feel safer seeing a lamp glowing across the street, you're not just avoiding darkness, you're still waiting for a town crier to shout the hour. You're still hoping the night has rules. The night grows colder as you continue beneath the faint flicker of street lanterns. Somewhere nearby, a door creaks open and shuts just as quickly. A dog barks, then goes quiet. And above it all, the rhythmic call of the watchman echoes faintly from another quarter. 2 o'clock and all's well. You stop in your tracks, not because the hour matters, but because the sound does. It's the voice of order, drifting through the night like a lullaby for the town. And it wasn't always so peaceful. In the medieval world, the dark was untrustworthy. The later the hour, the more suspicion followed your footsteps. This wasn't just fear. It was law. Many cities had night books, official logs kept by watchmen to record who was seen out after curfew and why. In parts of Germany, if you were found wandering after dark without explanation, your name was entered into the red ledger, a warning list consulted during future disputes, or worse, trials. Even homes had their part to play. Householders were required to keep their door latches drawn, their fires covered, and their lamps extinguished by the last bell. The phrase, "lock the door before the town sleeps," wasn't just grandmotherly advice, it was statute. In some towns, failing to secure your home was a finable offence, particularly if your open door led to theft or arson. You pass a low wooden bench outside a baker's shop. It's empty now, but by daybreak it'll be bustling. Interestingly, some of the earliest exceptions to curfew laws were bakers and brewers, whose work had to begin in the darkest hours to prepare for the sunlit rush. These exceptions were granted in writing, often as parchment tokens with stamped seals handed to the night watch captain each month. That's right. You had to earn the right to be outside. Fast forward to now, you walk your dog at 10 p.m, you drive to a 24-hour grocery store, you take a midnight train. But still, there are echoes. Some neighbourhoods feel safe only when the streetlights are on. Gated communities post curfew notices. And in times of unrest or pandemic, governments reach instinctively for that oldest lever, the curfew. Because deep down, we've never stopped believing that the night is different. Even our modern lighting is built on medieval logic. Gas lamps in the 18th century, a return to the town lanterns, electric grids designed to brighten entire streets, a scaled-up version of the candle ordinance. And if you doubt the power of light, consider this. In many cities, street lamp placement still correlates with property values. More light, more safety, more privilege. You turn a final corner and approach your lodging again. A lantern burns quietly at the entrance, casting soft shadows across the threshold. Above it, a sign reads, "Visitors welcome. Quiet hours begin at 10. That small phrase, quiet hours, sounds modern, gentle, but it's the same curfew in softer clothing. A relic that no longer needs bells or watchmen to be obeyed. It lives in signs, in zoning codes, in social pressure. You whisper in the hallway, not because you must, but because something ancient inside you remembers that after dark the rules change. You close the door behind you. The lantern flickers once and goes out. The next morning brings with it a softer kind of noise, the low clatter of carts, a rooster's cry somewhere over the rooftops, and beneath it all, the high, clear ringing of a bell. But this isn't the town clock, nor a curfew chime. This bell belongs to the small stone building near the priory, the grammar school, and what it summons is a ritual just as old, just as rule-bound, and far more familiar than you'd expect. Because today, you're stepping into a medieval classroom, and whether you realise it or not, you've never left. The students file in slowly, boys mostly, though a few girls in the wealthier towns. They sit at long creaking benches, arranged in neat rows facing forward. The teacher, a stooped man in a robe speckled with ink, watches without speaking. Only when the bell stops does he rise. No one moves. This silence isn't fear, it's discipline, learned, expected, and deeply enforced. And as you take a seat in the back, you begin to notice something uncanny. This doesn't feel ancient, it feels familiar. Because the structure of the room, the front-facing layout, the central authority figure, the recitation aloud, the punishment for speaking out of turn, is still the blueprint of education today. It all began in places like this. Medieval schools, especially those run by monasteries or under church influence, were founded on order. Students arrived at the same hour each day, answered roll call and recited lessons aloud in Latin. If they failed, they were corrected, not just gently. Corporal punishment was common. Wooden rods, birch branches, even public shaming. Standing with a dunce cap wasn't Victorian, it was much older. You glance at the walls and spot something remarkable. A seating chart carved into the bench itself. Names, initials, numbers. Assigned places weren't flexible. Students were seated by age, ability, or status. And no, you couldn't choose your seat near the window because you liked the breeze. Where you sat reflected your rank. Even the method of instruction remains eerily modern. The teacher calls on a student. The child stands, recites a memorized passage, and waits for the nod of approval. Another is called. He stumbles. The teacher taps a stick gently. Again. This wasn't education as curiosity. It was education as obedience. Learning to think came later. First, you learn to behave. Sound familiar? Rows of desks, the front of the class, raised hands, roll call, the expectation to sit still for hours. These aren't neutral designs, they're medieval mechanisms, crafted to manage large numbers of children with limited resources and one adult in charge. Even the idea of homework has roots here. In many towns, students were expected to memorize passages overnight, usually religious texts, to recite the next day. And if they failed, they weren't just shamed. Their families could be penalized. Education was a family responsibility, and a moral one. You look around and realize the blackboard is missing, but only just. In its place, a large slate set on an easel written in chalk. The students copy it down onto smaller tablets. Individual slates, the ancestors of your notebook. And if you're thinking this all feels rigid, you're right. But for centuries, it worked. And for centuries after, we copied it. You stay in the back as the day unfolds, watching the classroom breathe like a machine, bells dictating transitions, students rising and sitting in tight rhythm, each movement drilled over weeks, months, years. The teacher doesn't yell, he doesn't need to. The room is already trained. But this isn't military camp. This is school. And the strangest thing is, so much of it survived into yours. As the lesson shifts from Latin to arithmetic, you notice a pattern. The teacher asks a question, a student answers, and then the next student repeats the same answer aloud. It isn't just about understanding, it's about reinforcement, repetition, and echo. A medieval learning method known as choral recitation. Even now, traces of it linger in classrooms where students read in unison or repeat the multiplication table together. It's not efficient, but it's deeply memorably structured. You glance at a wooden panel nailed to the wall. It's a behaviour board, though they wouldn't have called it that. Small wooden pegs hang from notches, each marked with a name. A misstep. The peg is moved down. A good answer, it moves up. Sound familiar? House points, conduct marks, gold stars, detention slips. All these modern classroom tools began here, where learning was inseparable from judgment. The school day itself follows a shape you already know. Morning lessons, midday break, afternoon recitation. No periods or subject switching, those came later. But the rhythm of divided time was present. And lunch? It wasn't about relaxation. It was about maintaining discipline while feeding the mind. Students ate in silence, food often provided by the church or guild, and were expected to recite prayers before and after eating. You peek into the corner and find a smaller chamber with wooden benches and worn copies of psalters. This was the punishment room. Not for beatings, those were public. No, this was for writing lines. Students forced to copy moral proverbs dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. Idle hands do the devil's work. Speak only when invited. The point wasn't the content, it was the submission. This wasn't education as we understand it now, nurturing the mind, encouraging questions. It was formation, shaping children into obedient, literate citizens of the town and church. And to some degree we still do it. You think of bell schedules, assigned seating, silence in halls, permission slips, uniforms, pledge recitations. Where did all this come from? Not modern science, medieval order, and the teacher. You watch him from the back, his tone even, his posture, controlled, his every gesture carrying quiet authority. Not a tyrant, but not your friend. That idea of the teacher as moral guardian, as priest and parent rolled into one, began here. Long before pedagogical theories, there was the expectation that to teach was to command. And now, you still call it a classroom. You still raise your hand. You still feel a little twinge of nervousness when entering one. even as an adult. The smells may have changed, chalk to whiteboard markers, parchment to photocopies, but the structure, the choreography, the hierarchy, it's all still carved into the desk. The classroom fades behind you, but the feeling doesn't. That strange mix of discipline, stillness, and hierarchy, it clings to your movements, even as you return to the street. You walk quietly, hands behind your back, instinctively waiting for some unseen bell to ring. But none comes. You're in the central market now, it's bustling. Voices rise and overlap, the clink of coin, the thud of sacks drop to the ground. But something feels different. Amid the noise, there's a pattern, a quiet kind of structure. No shouting matches, no elbows thrown, no rush. People are waiting. One by one, buyers approach stalls. They don't swarm, they wait, sometimes with arms folded, sometimes marking their place with a foot, a glance, or a muttered, "After you." And here it is again, plain as daylight. A line, a queue, a medieval solution to human chaos. You approach the bread cart and there it is, a row of 6, all standing with some version of patience. There's no rope, no painted floor markings, but no one needs them, because the logic is already inside you. Back in the 12th and 13th centuries, markets were sites of friction. Crowds crushed forward, tempers flared, bakers and butchers shouted to keep order. Goods were limited, and there was always someone louder, stronger, or more desperate. So towns began passing ordinances, not just about weights and measures, but about orderly buying. In some places that meant guards, in others it meant wooden queue rails, early versions of stanchions, and in the more prosperous cities, it meant spoken rules, reinforced by shame. Cut in line, you'd be called a thief, a cheat, or, worst of all, a lordling, pretending to be above the people. You glance at the man ahead of you. He steps forward, accepts a loaf, drops a coin, and moves on. The next person steps forward without hesitation. The rhythm never breaks. This isn't efficiency, it's culture, trained into people, passed down over generations. And it began in places like this, market squares where disorder meant real danger. But it wasn't just markets. You follow the smell of herbs to a nearby apothecary. The space inside is tiny, just one counter, one stool, and a low ceiling hung with drying bundles. And yet, outside, a line again. And this one is more formal. A carved wooden token hangs near the door. A flat disc with a single slash on one side and a loop of twine. It's passed from one customer to the next. This is a turn token, used in hundreds of towns to mark a place in line when queues couldn't be supervised. Hold the token, it's your turn. Pass it, and you've yielded your place. Lose it, and you lose your right. Sound familiar? Think of waiting rooms, DMV slips, numbered deli tickets, online ticketing systems. All of them descend from the simple medieval urge to keep the peace. Because when bread is scarce and tempers are high, fairness isn't a luxury. It's the only thing standing between market and mob. You watch the token pass hands again, one weathered palm to another, no word spoken. The apothecary door creaks open, another customer enters, and the small crowd outside adjusts as one. It's a subtle movement, but precise, like gears clicking into place. And once again, you're struck by just how strange it is. We treat queuing like instinct, but it's not. It's training. It's history. It's the ghost of a rule book no one remembers reading. You move on from the apothecary, down the cobbled street where the fishmonger shouts about eels and perch, and spot another line. But this one's different. It's not for goods. It's for justice. Outside the town hall, a group of townspeople has gathered beneath a wooden canopy. There's no shouting, no crowding. They're holding slips of parchment, complaints, petitions, oaths, and again they're waiting. One by one they approach a clerk seated behind a heavy table, his quill scratching names into a ledger. This is the queue of the powerless, and here, more than anywhere else, medieval queuing became moral. It wasn't just about fairness, it was about surrendering ego. You waited because you had no choice. Because the system demanded that you prove your humility before it would even hear your voice. In many towns, refusing to wait your turn to speak with an official could result in being barred from the court for weeks, or even branded as disruptive, a charge that could follow you for life. In Florence, some city officials kept misconduct ledgers where names of those who cut in line were inscribed in red ink, not as criminals, just as undignified. And that word, dignity, was everything. In medieval society, waiting your turn wasn't weakness, it was character. The rich didn't line up, of course, they sent servants. But among the common people, your place in line reflected your place in the world. Skip the queue, and you didn't just break order, you insulted everyone behind you. And now, you stand in modern queues and still feel it. That slight uptightness when someone nudges too close. That flash of rage when someone pretends not to see the line. You're not just annoyed, you feel violated. A pact has been broken. A line older than roads has been crossed. Even children are taught it before they can spell. Wait your turn. We drill it into them not because it's convenient, but because we fear what happens without it. Disorder, frustration, injustice, and online. We may not think of it as queuing, but we stand in line digitally every day. Refreshing pages to buy concert tickets, waiting in matchmaking lobbies. You're number 204 in the support chat. It feels natural, but it's not. It's a virtual marketplace built on medieval instincts. Even theme parks, with all their tech and polish, are still just modern queues in disguise, ropes and pathways designed to simulate fairness and trick the brain into patience. Some even use interactive distractions, not unlike the town criers who once entertained breadlines with local gossip. You take one last look back at the town hall queue, still there, still moving, still obeying the rhythm of the token, the order of names, the belief, however fragile, that fairness is real, and justice comes to those who wait. And you realize, we didn't inherit queues because they're efficient. We inherited them because somewhere in our bones, we remember what it's like to need order more than speed. The bells are silent now and the market is thinning. But just beyond the square, where the taverns cluster together like overgrown mushrooms, the rhythm picks up again. Slower, warmer, more unpredictable. Wooden mugs clink. Laughter stumbles through open windows, and somewhere above it all you catch the distant jingle of a coin purse being cinched tight. You duck into the narrow lane beside the copper kettle, and you already know what's going on. Hospitality rules, those old unspoken agreements that still shape how we eat, how we treat guests, and how we pay for service we can't measure. And here's the strange part. They're all medieval. You step into the dim tavern and feel it immediately. The air is thicker, not just with heat and smoke, but with expectation. At one table, a traveller is pressing a few small coins into a serving girl's palm. At another, a merchant waves for wine and casually flips a silver groat toward the bar. No one asks for a tip, but everyone gives one. Because in the Middle Ages, hospitality wasn't a transaction, it was a test. You didn't pay just for food or drink. You paid for trust, for safety, for the hope that your meat wasn't spoiled, your ale wasn't watered down, and your purse wouldn't disappear while you slept. The tipping custom, which we think of as modern, is rooted in survival. Back then, inns were precarious places. No licensing, no food safety codes. If the server didn't like your face, your soup might taste strange. If you were rude to the cook, your bed might be shared with rats. So, what did people do? They paid early. quietly, discreetly. A few extra coins slipped across the counter to ensure goodwill. This was called vales in England, drikkapeng in Scandinavia, literally drink money. Not a reward, a down payment on dignity. You glance toward the fire pit. A group of locals are gathered there, talking low. You catch a phrase. He left nothing. Heads shake. The implication is clear. Someone skipped the custom. Not the bill, the courtesy. And that, even more than theft, marks you as unwelcome. Because tipping wasn't just economic, it was social. It told the room, I understand how this works. It told the server, I see your labour. And in a time when many servers were little more than property, serfs, servants, women with no legal standing, a coin was one of the few ways to offer something back. But it could also be corrupted. You pass a carved beam near the tavern's back door and notice deep grooves, marks made by knives, a servant's tally. For each generous guest, a notch. Why? Because some tipped not for service, but for silence, to keep secrets, to ensure discretion, to bend the rules. Sound familiar? Modern tipping often carries the same ambiguity. Is it gratitude, obligation, insurance? You leave extra for good service, but also when you fear retaliation. You tip the hotel porter not just to be kind, but because he has your bags. The airport bartender, because you'll be back in 20 minutes and don't want spit in your tonic. This moral grey zone, it's medieval. It's the shadow that stretches from stone taverns to sushi counters, from feasting halls to food trucks. We've built apps, point-of-sale systems and mandatory gratuities. But at its heart, the tip is still a whispered offer between one human and another. Be kind to me. I know the dance. And if you don't know it, you risk becoming a story told by firelight. You linger near the tavern's rear wall, letting the warmth of the hearth chase the damp from your coat. Behind you, the conversations flow in loops. Barter, banter, gossip. But the one thing no one mentions directly, yet everyone practices, is that unspoken tradition, the guest code. It's as alive here as the ale is strong. Because in the medieval world, being a guest wasn't a right. It was a privilege wrapped in performance. And whether you were breaking bread or breaking your journey for the night, there were rules. You head upstairs, creaking floorboards beneath your feet, toward the inn's small sleeping quarters. Just outside each door on a small shelf lies a wooden plate. Not for food, for coin. Payment in advance. In many medieval inns, guests were expected to deposit a token amount outside their door, not for the innkeeper, but for the servant. A thank you in advance for clean sheets, an extra coal for the brazier, or even just leaving your boots untouched. You peek inside one empty room, modest. A straw mattress, 2 rough woolen blankets, a wash basin. But hanging near the door, you see something curious. A tiny bell. Guests would ring it not to summon help, but to signal they were not to be disturbed. A subtle signal. A silent shield. Respecting that signal wasn't just courtesy, it was law. In many towns, servants entering a guest room uninvited could be whipped, fined or fired, especially if the guest was noble. Yet the guest too was bound by law. In places like Flanders, if a traveller failed to tip appropriately, and the servant brought this before the guild or innkeeper, the guest could be blacklisted. Their name written into a small ledger, banned from staying again. These black books circulated among taverns and inns across regions. A bad guest in York might find no bed in Canterbury. Hospitality was a network, and your behaviour followed you. And not just among the rich. Even in humble village homes the rules were sacred. If you were offered bread, you were to eat it. If given wine, you must at least sip. To refuse food or drink was to insult the host, and by extension, the household's dignity. That's why even today, You might feel awkward saying no thank you when someone offers you tea. You're not just declining refreshment, you're testing an ancient social bond. You descend the stairs slowly, noticing a new guest at the bar fumbling with his purse. A local watches, eyes narrowing. No tip, no coin for the girl who poured his drink. Just a hasty nod and a muttered thanks. It's subtle, but you feel the room shift. Hospitality, even now, has layers, and those who ignore them, those who skip the dance, stand out. Today you think of tips as line items, service charges, percentages. But the instinct to leave something extra, that's medieval guilt speaking through centuries of candlelit suppers and quiet coins slipped beneath plates. Even modern customs echo this hierarchy. Why do you bring wine when visiting someone's home? Why do hotels leave envelopes labelled housekeeping? Why do weddings have seating charts? And why is it considered rude to switch places? Because we're still living under the guest code. You don't just arrive, you present yourself, you signal respect, you acknowledge the invisible work of others. And if you forget, well, someone will remember for you. The next morning you're back in the town square. The sunlight is sharp, the market is waking, and a boy no older than 10 is running through the street shouting names. Names you recognise. Not people, but things. Baker, Potter, Millwright, Fletcher. He stops at each shop, calls out the trade, and then moves on. You watch, puzzled at first, until you notice what he's holding. A wax tablet with a list. He's not just delivering messages, he's gathering taxes. But not in coin, not yet. First, he's confirming names. And suddenly it clicks. You're not hearing jobs, you're hearing surnames, those old labels that once told the Crown what you did, where you lived, and how much you owed. You follow the boy to a counting house on the edge of the square. Inside, a clerk sits behind a tall desk flanked by shelves of parchment rolls, sticks with notches, and a small iron seal. The boy hands him the tablet. The clerk begins calling names again. Not the way you hear them today, but in their original form. William of the Hill, Thomas, son of Everard, Agnes of the Mill Lane. It's a census, a tax roll, a record of identity built entirely on place and roll. And here's the strange part. Most of these people still exist, through you. Your surname might be Smith, or Carter, or Brewer, Taylor, Wright, Shepherd. These aren't just family names, they're occupational designations burned into history, a medieval fingerprint, and originally they weren't passed down. They were assigned, changed when your job changed. If you move from the forge to the mill, your name might shift from Smith to Miller, but that wasn't sustainable for the taxman. So governments began to freeze names, fix them to bloodlines, not labour. That way, your family's identity could be traced, billed, recruited, or punished across generations. In parts of England and France, this became law by the 14th century. If your name wasn't fixed, you were suspect, vagrant, unlanded, or foreign. Stability meant trackability, and that to a medieval bureaucracy was everything. You glance back at the town clerk as he picks up a tally stick. A narrow piece of wood with notches carved along its edge. One stick is split in half, lengthwise. One part is given to the taxpayer, the other remains here. A medieval receipt. The match must be perfect. The grain, the cut, the angle of the notches. If someone tries to cheat the tax or forge a record, the stick won't align. This isn't primitive, it's brilliant anti-fraud design. Even modern barcodes can't quite replicate it. And it all revolves around names. Flash forward. Today, your name is tied to everything. Government IDs, tax forms, school records, hospital charts. You correct people when they spell it wrong. You insist on its proper use. But very few of us remember it wasn't always ours. It was once a tool of control. You didn't get to choose your name. You received it like a seal pressed in wax. And if you bore the name of a criminal, a heretic, a rebel, you bore the punishment too. Even today, surnames carry legacy. Family reputations still open doors or close them. You're judged by what your ancestors did centuries ago, sometimes with pride, sometimes with quiet shame. But always the name follows, like the boy in the street calling it out into morning light. The clerk finishes his roll call, ties the wax tablet with a bit of string, and tucks it into a wooden coffer marked with iron studs. The boy, list in hand, disappears down a side alley. The square quiets again. But in your mind, the names still echo, not just because they're old, but because they're still walking around. You think of your neighbours, your friends, your co-workers. How many of them bear names that were never meant to be surnames, just descriptions? Long, short, young, Armstrong, white, black. These weren't titles, they were labels, given out by tacksmen, priests and city scribes to distinguish one John from another. John the Tall, John the Pale, John with the Crooked Tooth, and once they stuck, they stayed. But it wasn't always fair. You pass a church door where a smaller register is nailed. It's a list of forbidden names, not officially banned, but discouraged by the parish. Names of heretics, criminals, excommunicated rebels. Children born with those names were often assigned new ones at baptism, saintly ones. The idea? To overwrite the past. But everyone still remembered. In whispers, those families were known not by their new names, but their old shadows. Even today, some countries restrict what names parents can give. Not because of superstition, but because of bureaucratic fear. Germany, Iceland, and parts of Asia have naming laws that reflect medieval thinking. Names must be appropriate, must indicate gender, must not dishonour the child, and more than anything, they must fit the registry, and the registry, that ancient list, is where the real story lies. You enter the Guildhall briefly and find a dusty ledger open on a stand. Inside, the pages are crowded with names, occupations, dues paid, but a column to the right surprises you. Marks of behaviour, a dot for timely payment, a slash for disputes, a star for generosity. Names weren't just for tracking taxes. They were used to build reputations, early versions of credit scores, loyalty programs, blacklists, and yes, these notations often passed down too. If your father was marked as troublesome, you might be denied an apprenticeship. If your mother was noted for debt, you might struggle to join a guild. Family names carried weight, and not always by choice. In medieval Spain and Portugal, surnames could be used to identify conversos, Jews and Muslims forced to convert to Christianity. Some were given distinctly artificial names by the state. Others adopted Christian ones but were still tracked for generations. A name wasn't protection. It was a paper trail. Even now, names can shape your path. Job applications, loan approvals, online searches. Studies have shown that some names still receive less attention, fewer callbacks, more suspicion. And all of this, rooted in a system built long before you were born, when the first clerk dipped a quill into ink and tried to make sense of the people he owed taxes. You exit the hall and pause beneath a stone carving above the door. A figure holding a scroll in one hand and a key in the other. The scroll bears names. The key unlocks consequences. You trace your own names silently in the air, letters you've always known. But behind them now, you see the scaffold, the ledger, the ink, the rules. Your name is yours. But once, it was not. And perhaps in ways you'll never quite shake, it still belongs to the page. You wander north toward the legal quarter where the cobblestones are smoother and the buildings stand taller, less soot-stained, more precise. Above one doorway, carved in weathered limestone, is a pair of open hands. Beneath them, a set of balanced scales. The emblem of a magistrate, yes, but also of something deeper, older, the ritual of truth. You step inside the hall and are met with quiet, just a scratch of quills, the creak of benches, the faint shuffle of leather-soled shoes. At the far end, a wooden platform stands beneath a tall window. A man approaches it slowly, removes his cap and raises one hand. The right hand, always the right. Because here, in this echoing chamber, you're watching a medieval performance of honesty, one you still know by heart. Even if you've never been in court, you've seen it. Hand raised, oath taken, truth promised. But this isn't just courtroom tradition. It's a theatrical remnant of medieval justice, where truth had to be performed, not just spoken. Back then, courts were noisy, public, and deeply suspicious of words alone. Swearing an oath wasn't just about speech. It was a physical gesture, often with your hand placed on a Bible, a relic, or even a saint's bone. But if no object was present, the raised right hand sufficed. It showed you were unarmed, open, honest, vulnerable. Refuse to raise your hand. That alone could cast doubt. You take a seat on a creaky bench near the wall. A clerk reads out names, one by one. Each is followed by a voice affirming their presence, and when they respond, some bow slightly, some nod, but all maintain eye contact. Because in medieval courts, gaze mattered. Looking away while taking an oath could discredit your testimony. Some judges even kept notes on where witnesses stared. But truth wasn't just tested with eyes and hands, it was tested with risk. You glance at a framed parchment on the wall, a 14th century court record. At the bottom, 3 signatures, not scribbled names but full oaths written out in longhand, each ending with a chilling line. And if I lie, may God strike me down and the earth forget my name. That wasn't poetic, it was binding. In some courts, especially in Northern Europe, witnesses had to offer collateral, a token, a coin, or even their belt to swear the truth. If they were found lying later, they didn't get it back, and their name was added to a black list carved into the door of the hall. These weren't punishments. They were ritual reinforcements. The court wasn't just a place for legal facts, it was a stage, and every gesture, from the raised hand to the spoken word, was a costume you wore to play the role of an honest man. And you still do. Raise your right hand, swear on a book, speak so help me God. Even in secular courts, these echoes remain. They're not legally required, but they're almost always used. Why? Because deep down we still believe that truth must be accompanied by form, that honesty is more believable when it comes with a little theatre, and if you think it ends at the courtroom, wait until you check the little box online. I certify that this information is true. That too is a vow, no relic, no gesture. But the system still assumes you know the weight of swearing. And it began in rooms like this, with raised hands, watching eyes, and the oldest question of all, do you swear to tell the truth? The man lowers his hand, the oath spoken, and takes a few steps back as the clerk scribbles something into the register. Around the room, no one claps, no one speaks, but there's a weight that settles, like a string pulled tight. The oath has been made. Everyone in the chamber felt it, and for a moment you do too, because you realise now that the courtroom isn't designed for logic, it's designed for memory, for marking moments, binding people to their words in ways they can't undo. In medieval towns, courts were held not behind doors, but in the open air or public halls so that the community could bear witness. Truth wasn't private, it was collective, and so were the consequences. You pass along the edge of the room and notice a smaller side chamber, barely wide enough for a table and 2 stools. This was a swearing room, used for private oaths of debt, confession, or small claims. On the table rests a smooth stone, a relic perhaps. You run your fingers over it and see faint scratches where names may have been carved, rubbed away, re-added. Not everyone was trusted to speak truth aloud. In many medieval towns, people who'd once lied in court were required to wear a truth collar, a visible badge, sometimes of iron, hung from the neck when appearing again. Others had to bring oath helpers, people who would vouch for your character before you were even allowed to speak. These were not legal witnesses. These were moral sponsors, and the oath itself? It changed by context. In debt courts you swore on your soul. In trade courts you might swear on your guild's name. In land disputes you swore on the bones of your ancestors, literally in some cases with relics brought from the family chapel. But always the idea was the same. Truth wasn't assumed. It was constructed. And when that truth broke down, you were branded a false man. In Anglo-Saxon law, to be named false was not just dishonour. It was legal death. Your word could no longer be accepted in court. You couldn't testify, couldn't accuse, couldn't marry legally without witness. You became invisible to the justice system. You take a seat again as another case begins. The accused is brought forward, a woman in a plain shawl. She says nothing yet, just stares ahead. A witness is summoned. He enters, nods, and, without prompting, raises his right hand. He doesn't need to. The court already has his statement. But he does it anyway. And there it is again. The ritual, centuries old, instinctive now, a gesture that carries weight, because it has always carried weight. Even now in modern courtrooms the same choreography plays out. The raised hand, the solemn tone, the moment where everyone, even the judge, goes quiet. And we accept it, because we want to believe truth is something more than speech, something we can recognize by stance, gesture, rhythm, something that links us to all those who swore before us, beneath wooden rafters, beside relics, before crowds. You leave the hall slowly, and as the heavy door closes behind you, you feel it settle in your bones. To raise your hand is to lift the past, and to speak the truth. That's never just words. The wind shifts as you step out into the square again, and you catch the smell of something strangely familiar. Sharp, metallic, with a faint undertone of vinegar. You follow it, winding past a row of apothecaries and alehouses until you reach a wooden structure nestled behind the old baths. It looks ordinary, a long bench, a water basin, a few buckets stacked by the wall, but the sign above it says everything. Wash before return. You smile, because somehow, deep in the medieval maze of life and labour, you've stumbled upon something that still clings to modern existence with quiet persistence. The expectation to wash your hands, not just a health tip, not just a habit, but once, a deeply moral obligation. Back in the 14th century, people didn't fully understand germs, of course, but that didn't mean they ignored hygiene. Quite the opposite. Monasteries and bathhouses had entire rituals of cleansing, and before many activities, eating, praying, treating the wounded, you were expected to perform a specific wash, with witnesses. And this wasn't just water and go. The medieval hand wash was deliberate, ceremonial even. You'd pour from a jug into a bowl, never dip into standing water, dry with a linen cloth, often shared but carefully rotated. In noble households, a servant would carry a portable ewer and basin before and after meals, and guests were judged by how they used it. Splash too much, and you were wasteful. Skip it entirely, and you were uncultured, or worse, unsanitary. You pause and dip your hands into the basin. It's cool, refreshing. Nearby a boy scrubs a set of wooden tools. He glances at you, then returns to his work. No one told him to clean, but the rule is already there, unwritten, unspoken. Clean it before you pass it on. In many guilds, this principle wasn't just expected, it was enforced. The Guild of Surgeons, for instance, had formal rules about washing hands and tools with vinegar, rose water, or wine between patients. Violating the rule could result in a fine or suspension. And while they didn't know about microbes, they absolutely believed in invisible corruption. You walk a little farther and notice a row of basins outside a schoolhouse. Children, one by one, are washing their hands before going inside. There's no soap, just water and rhythm. And one small girl, you notice, mouths a phrase as she scrubs. Perhaps a rhyme, perhaps a rule. This isn't about germs, it's about ritual cleanliness. Medieval society associated filth with sin. To be clean was not only healthier, it was more virtuous. The church reinforced it. Wash before Mass, wash before confession, wash before handling sacred texts. Even common folk followed these cues. But it wasn't just religious. In 15th century Venice, ship workers returning from abroad were required to wash, and then wait 40 days before entering the city, giving rise to the term quarantina. Yes, quarantine literally began as a cleaning and waiting ritual enforced at the ports. It was part fear, part tradition, and entirely medieval. You turn back toward the market. The basins behind you ripple in the breeze, and the wooden sign creaks softly in the wind. Wash before return. You've seen it on modern lab doors, in restaurants, on daycare walls. But its bones are older, much older, because long before science gave it reasons, society gave it meaning. To wash was to belong. You keep walking, the scent of herbs and soap lingering on your hands as you pass a line of laundresses bent over a stone trough. They aren't just scrubbing clothes, they're scrubbing stories, gossip passed from one washer to the next, each rinse another secret shared. And you realise, in the medieval world, cleanliness wasn't solitary, it was communal. Whether at bathhouses, wash basins, or public fountains, people gathered around water like moths to flame. It was a stage for behaviour. You were watched, judged, included, or excluded based on your participation in the cleansing ritual. Skip it, and you might not be served food. Show up dirty to a trade meeting, and no one would shake your hand. Even contracts, those dusty scrolls sealed with wax, were sometimes preceded by ritual washing. To cleanse the hands before touching a binding agreement was to show that your intentions were clean too. You glance at a nearby abbey wall where an iron spout drips into a mossy stone basin. Carved just beneath the lip is a phrase in Latin, munditia corporis, puritas mentis, cleanliness of the body, purity of the mind. It's not a slogan, it's a commandment. In many convents and monasteries, novices were taught a specific washing order each morning. Face first, then hands, then feet. You weren't just washing dirt, you were reenacting humility. Monks washed one another's feet before Lent, mimicking Christ. Knights bathed before their dubbing ceremony to signify moral rebirth. And when medieval surgeons performed amputations, yes, they washed. But not just to protect the patient. They did it to invoke divine mercy, believing that clean hands were more likely to be guided by God. Sound familiar? You look at your own modern world. Hospitals with automatic sinks, hand sanitizer stations at every door. And if you skip the sink at a restaurant restroom, you know someone's watching. Because the old rule survives, hands must be cleaned before action. It doesn't matter that we now say for 20 seconds or recite happy birthday while lathering. That's just a modern version of what medieval housewives sang under their breath while cleaning. Little rhymes to keep the rhythm going. Same cadence, same lesson. And when disease strikes, flu, COVID, the unnamed threats of tomorrow, the very first advice isn't new, it's ancient. Wash your hands. That act, that pause, that ritual, it still tells the world something about you, that you're thoughtful, that you're safe, that you won't pass harm from one person to another. Just like it did back when soap was made from ashes and sheep fat, and when a basin was placed outside every alehouse door. You glance once more at the quiet corner where the old trough waits, rain collecting in the hollow. A boy walks up and washes a single apple before eating it. No one asked him to, he just knows. Because the rule is old, and it works, and you're still following it. You step into a narrow alley where a crooked sign creaks above you, by leave of Bell, and realise you've wandered near the guild houses. The scent of leather, parchment, and ale wafts out from every doorway. Inside, workers lean over ledgers, stamp seals into wax, and murmur figures beneath flickering rushlights. It's quieter than you'd expect for the heart of the city's industry. Because the clock hasn't struck yet. You look up, and there it is, the bell tower, tall and sooty, standing watch like an old judge. And suddenly, you're reminded of another rule that still shapes your days, though you've long stopped questioning it. The medieval obsession with time. Not just time in general, but structured, segmented, communal time, all dictated by bells. The modern 9 to 5, the concept of the workday, that feeling you get when lunch hits noon on the dot, or when your shift ends at 5 sharp. All of it started with bells like the one above you, monastic, mechanical, inescapable. In the early medieval world, time was natural, sunrises, shadows, birdsong. But once monasteries began organising life around strict prayer intervals, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline, they needed a reliable way to keep everyone in sync. And so, bells were born into power. You hear one now. It rings out from the tower, and within seconds, shutters open, boots scuffle on cobbles, apprentices appear with crates, and a woman down the street flips her sign from closed to trade welcome. Time just changed. The bell didn't just measure time, it created it. It told people when to work, rest, eat, or pray. Entire towns sync their days to a single chime. And as trade expanded and city life grew more complex, the rhythm became standardized. That's right. Your lunch break exists because 700 years ago, monks decided that sext, the 6th hour after sunrise, was a good time to pause for food and contemplation. But it didn't stop at monasteries. Guilds adopted these rhythms too. The Worshipful Company of Bakers, for instance, started shifts at prime, around 6 a.m., and ended work at none, around 3 p.m. Any loaves sold past that bell were considered stale or dishonest. Bakers caught cheating time could be fined or expelled. You pass by a small workshop where a young man sets down his tools and stretches his arms wide. He doesn't look at a clock, he just waits for the next bell. You check your pocket, out of habit, and feel your phone there. Its screen is dark, but you already know the time, because your world is still ruled by bells. They're just silent now. The bell finishes its toll, and a hush spreads across the street like a tide going out. You notice how easily people adapt their pace, not because someone ordered it, but because they've learned to feel time passing together. It's not personal time, it's public time, and it's older than you think. In many medieval towns, the bell wasn't just for monks or guildsmen, it was for everyone. It rang out for curfews, market openings, and even morning cleanups. In some places, the evening bell meant it was time to put out your fires, literally. That's where the phrase, cover your fire or couvre-feu, came from. Yes, that's where we get the word curfew. In fact, failure to obey the bell was a punishable offence. If you were found wandering after the curfew bell rang, you could be fined, whipped, or locked up in a pillory overnight, unless you had special permission, marked by a wooden token stamped with the town seal. You walk a little farther and spot a child playing with a wooden disc. She flips it in the air and catches it. You lean closer and see a faded carving, an old guild mark. That's no toy, that's a time pass. In cities like York or Ghent, these tokens allowed merchants or messengers to move after hours, like a medieval version of an employee badge or backstage pass. But the catch? Only a few were ever issued. They were passed from hand to hand with trust, and losing one could cost you your job or your guild status. You hear another bell, this one smaller, from the direction of the dockyard. A lunch bell? Or perhaps a warning of approaching tide? It doesn't matter. People adjust. Doors open or close. Carts shift direction. A man near you sighs and rises. His bell has spoken. You follow him through a courtyard with a stone sundial at its centre. It's cracked now, overgrown with lichen, but you can still read the inscription. Time is the town's master, but bells speak for him. It's true. Even now, with your wristwatch or digital calendar, you still obey the fragments of that medieval clockwork world. Workday starts at 9, lunch breaks at 12, meetings in 15-minute blocks, school bells ring, fire drills start, church services begin, not because time flows naturally, but because someone once rang a bell. Even the way your phone dings, softly, urgently, or musically, isn't new. It's an echo, a polite digital descendant of the clanging iron that once told your ancestors to pray, work, or seek shelter. You stop at a tavern whose sign simply reads, "The 7th hour." Inside, the air is warm and full of chatter. You smile, because you know what that means. It's time, and it always has been. The tavern's door swings shut behind you with a gentle thud, muffling the outside sounds. Inside, the world is quieter, darker, and warmer. Lanterns flicker along wooden beams, a fire crackles in the hearth, and there, on a wall near the bar, hangs something oddly familiar. A long wooden staff tipped with brass, marked with small notches and initials. It's not a weapon, it's a tally stick. And as you settle into a corner booth, the barkeep uses it to mark something, 2 notches across the grain, and leans it back against the wall. No receipt, no ledger, just one stick, one story. You're staring at a system that once ran entire economies, a rule so effective, so widespread, it lingered in the background of civilization for centuries. Don't trust the words, trust the cut. That was the logic behind the tally stick. In medieval England, and across much of Europe, literacy was rare. Paper was expensive. Ink was reserved for the powerful. So instead, common people, merchants, labourers, farmers, used carved wooden sticks to record debts, payments, trades, and even wages. Each stick was split lengthwise so the cut marks would align perfectly. One half went to the lender, the other to the debtor. These were called the stock and the foil, hence the modern word stockholder. You glance again at the staff behind the bar. Its grain is dark with age, but the notches are deep and precise, like scars in memory. It tells a tale, perhaps 2 pints owed, or an old tab from the man still chuckling by the fire. This wasn't crude bookkeeping, it was legally binding. In England, tally sticks were even used by the Exchequer, the government's treasury office, until the 1800s. They recorded taxes, loans and fines, stored in massive bundles that would later cause, quite literally, the burning down of Parliament in 1834 when someone thought it would be smart to dispose of the old tallies in a stove. But in the medieval world, the tally was more than a tool. It was a promise, physically split between 2 people. You couldn't cheat it. If your half didn't match the other's perfectly, the deal was invalid. You shift in your seat and run your fingers across the wooden table, imagining those same notches once carved here by firelight, the barkeep and a customer sealing a deal with a knife, a nod, and mutual trust. No apps, no signatures, just two halves of one truth. You sip something warm from a clay mug as a man at the bar taps his fingers on the wood, clearly waiting for someone. The bartender glances at the tally stick again, then nods. No words exchanged, just the silent recognition that a record had been made and would be honoured. You begin to realise the tally stick wasn't just about money, it was about trust. The rule behind it was simple yet profound. What is owed must be remembered, not by memory alone, but by mutual proof. And here's the twist. You still follow this rule today. Ever split a restaurant bill and Venmo later? That's just a tally, split in your head or logged in your phone. Ever used a punch card at a coffee shop? Bought a subway ride with a swipe? Every digital ledger, every invoice, every receipt is just the modern echo of that wooden stick with carved lines. Even the phrase short end of the stick, that's from this very system. The person who held only the foil without the full notched stock had weaker proof of the debt, less leverage, less power, and sometimes less justice. You glance around the tavern, imagine it centuries ago, when this exact booth might have seen two farmers carve a tally for seed grain, one notch for a bushel, two notches for transport, then split the stick, each walking away with half a contract. No one else needed to understand it. The notches were enough, and it wasn't limited to coins or ale. Tally sticks tracked taxes to kings, rents to landlords, wages to servants, and even dowel agreements in marriage, when two families marked a bride's portion on wood before the wedding feast. In many parts of Europe, a notched hazel stick was more respected in court than a spoken oath, because wood could not lie, and memory could. You rise and move closer to the fireplace, where another set of shorter tally sticks lies in a small wooden bowl. Likely old debts, repaid or forgiven. Some are broken clean through, like ritual closures, a way of saying, we're square now. And that idea lingers. How often do you check your digital balance just to be sure everything adds up? How many emails do you file away just in case? How often do you write things down, even with no intention of forgetting? Because deep down you still follow that rule. Write the promise. Break the promise together. That quiet system, carved into wood, honoured in silence, stored by firelight, still hums beneath your modern world, and now you know why. You step outside the tavern just as the final light of day stretches across the rooftops, warm and golden. Cobblestones glint faintly, and the air smells of earth, ale, and faint wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance a slow bell tolls one last time, perhaps a curfew, or simply the signal that the market stalls have closed. Either way, the day is winding down, and so are the rules. But there's one more that's followed you from the medieval world, quietly shaping everything from your morning routine to your idea of success, even if you've never given it a name. It's the unspoken rule of cleanliness. You think of it as hygiene. You call it grooming, skincare, tidiness. But to your medieval ancestors, this was more than mere appearance. It was moral order made visible. A clean face meant an honest heart. A washed robe meant God might look kindly upon you. And the rules were surprisingly strict. Not in the way you might think. Not everyone had soap and water. But they still obeyed rules around ritual bathing, linen changes, hair trimming, and fingernail scraping with a vigilance that would rival modern spa-goers. You pass a woman drawing water from a wooden bucket into a basin, her sleeves rolled up, fingers red from scrubbing. Not for laundry, for herself, because Saturday is the bathing day. It was in many medieval towns. Public bathhouses operated on weekly schedules, with men and women often taking turns. In Paris, a law once mandated that bathhouses stay open 3 nights a week. In England, monasteries required monks to bathe 4 times per year. Sounds sparse, until you realise that many commoners bathe just as often, if not more, especially before big events, market day, court appearances, holidays, weddings. Cleanliness was a public signal, a kind of announcement. I belong to order, not chaos. Even now, you're still doing it. You shower before a date. You tidy your hair before a job interview. You clip your nails before meeting the in-laws. None of this is medically essential. It's socially coded, just like it was in 1350. And then, of course, there was the linen rule. You turn a corner and spot a shirt hung to dry in a small window. White, well pressed, fluttering in the breeze. Centuries ago, this alone would mark a person's rank, because visible linen meant hidden cleanliness. In medieval Europe, they didn't wash outer garments often. Wool and silk were costly to clean, but linen, white, close to the body, easy to boil, became the symbol of purity. If your collar and cuffs gleamed, people assumed your underlayers were fresh too. A priest once said, "He who wears white linen sins not with filth." You smile, because your crisp button-down shirt, or that fresh undershirt beneath your hoodie, is just another echo. Cleanliness isn't just about health. It's a quiet contract, a way of saying, I respect myself and I expect you to too, even in a world without hot showers. You find yourself beneath a low-hung archway, where laundry flaps between two buildings, shirts, aprons, long strips of linen like banners of domestic routine. A cat perches on a windowsill, watching water drip from a cloth with the sort of lazy interest only cats possess. You pause there, under the fluttering fabric, as if standing in the final page of the day's unwritten rulebook, and that's when it really sinks in. You followed a trail of invisible rules all evening, some shouted by bells, others whispered by notched sticks or polished shoes or the clean white flash of collar linen, all of them ancient, all of them still pulsing quietly beneath your modern life. The medieval world isn't as far away as it looks on paper. Take your morning, you wake, wash your face, brush your teeth, put on clean clothes, maybe white socks, maybe a crisp shirt, and leave the house on time. That one act. A whole sequence of medieval codes, now second nature. Once upon a time, showing up clean and punctual could decide your social rank, your wage, even your survival. You apologize when you're late. You mark debts. You say please and thank you, even when no one demands it. You follow traffic signs, schedule meetings by the hour, keep quiet in elevators. These aren't laws, they're customs, rituals, echoes of rules once carved into wood, sewn into collars, or whispered in prayers. A barmaid passes you with a jug of water and nods politely. You nod back, aware suddenly of just how many of your gestures are inherited. Even that small nod, a tilt of respect that once would have accompanied the doffing of a cap or removal of a hood, feels older than it seems. In medieval courts, to appear unwashed or late was to be seen as morally careless. That's not so different from today, is it? Even your bedtime rituals carry traces of the past. Dim the lights, put the kettle on, set tomorrow's alarm. Maybe you draw the curtains, echoing an old superstition that night air carried illness, so windows were covered before bed. Maybe you brush your teeth, just as monks once rinsed their mouths with herbs before evening prayers. You're not just winding down, you're obeying. The rule of closure, of daily reset, of putting the body and mind in order before surrendering to sleep. You head back toward your own door, the tavern behind you now, the bells quiet, the alleys empty. You pass a basin of rainwater and see your own reflection, a little tired, maybe, but still upright, still obeying the rhythms that shaped people centuries ago. And that's the strangest rule of all. You didn't choose most of them. You inherited them. But here's the peace in it. These old rhythms aren't just constraints, they're comfort. predictable, shared, quietly connecting you to others, past and present, in a web of whispered agreements. Not laws, not commandments, just rules we still follow. And now that you've seen them, they'll follow you a little more closely tomorrow. But tonight, you wash your face, change your shirt, fluff your pillow, and let your body slip under the covers, the weight of the day lifted. Because the final rule of all, unchanged, eternal, is this: sleep when the world grows quiet. And now, let everything settle. Let your breath soften. The world outside can keep turning, its bells, its lists, its rituals. But for now, you've stepped out of it. You've wandered through centuries, touched linen sleeves, heard the echo of footsteps on worn stone floors. You've seen how even the smallest motions, how you greet someone, how you pay a debt, how you clean your hands, carry the fingerprints of people long gone. It's a strange kind of comfort, isn't it? Knowing that you are never truly alone in your habits, that others knelt beside wells, tucked in shirts, folded hands at night just like you do. You share more with them than you thought. Rules that shape their days still shape yours. Quiet rules, hidden ones. So let go of the day now. There's nothing more you need to do. Close your eyes. Let the ancient world fade. Let the silence grow long and safe around you. You're still, and the world is at rest.